Hello, welcome back. This lecture is an introduction to the sacred text of Judaism. Now, I know that there are hundreds of detailed introductions to the Old Testament, or more accurately, the Hebrew Bible. There's even an entire Great Courses lecture series devoted to the subject. But in the next few lectures, I'll briefly explain what's in the Hebrew Bible, where it comes from, and the role that it's played in Judaism over the centuries. I'll also show how it's connected to other texts that at least some Jews have regarded as sacred at different times and in different places. And I'll make comparisons to scriptures of other religious traditions. But I'm going to start in the middle with the story of one particular copy of the Hebrew Bible. This copy is called the Aleppo Codex. Aleppo is a city in Syria where this manuscript resided for some 600 years. And it's called a codex because it's a handwritten manuscript with two-sided pages bound along one edge. So it's like a modern book, as opposed to a rolled-up scroll. It's oftentimes referred to as the Crown of Aleppo, one of the great treasures of that part of the world. Many scholars consider it the oldest, most complete, most accurate text of the Hebrew Bible, even though a good-sized chunk has been missing since the 1940s in sort of an international Bible mystery. The Aleppo Codex was produced about 930 CE of the Common Era in the city of Tiberias on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee in a workshop overseen by one of the great masters of Jewish scripture production. His name was Aaron ben Asher, and his family had been in the business for many generations, in the business of copying biblical manuscripts. Like all Bibles at the time, it was copied by hand from earlier manuscripts that have since been lost, and it was copied onto pages that were made of animal skin. This was before the discovery of paper in the West, or actually the discovery of, or the invention of paper in China that then made its way to the West in the late Middle Ages. The Aleppo Codex was beautifully written on nearly 500 parchment leaves. So each leaf is made of skin, tanned skin, not paper. And each of those pages has 3 columns of 28 lines each. Just the materials and the labor that went into its production must have made it very, very valuable. Think of all of those animals that would have had to be killed and then their skins processed for it. But this particular copy was also extraordinarily accurate. Aaron ben Asher was a Masorete, that is, part of a group of scribes and scholars active from the 7th to the 11th centuries that were dedicated to preserving the text of the Hebrew Bible as accurately as possible. They faced 2 big challenges. The first was that copying by hand, even if done carefully, always produces mistakes, as the writer looks back and forth from the source manuscript to the new copy, and then back to the source and back to the copy. So sometimes they would misread things, letters that look similar or words that look similar, or they would mishear similar sounding words because they may have actually spoken it out loud, or even in your mind, you tend to vocalize things there. Or they might transpose letters as they were copying it down, or accidentally repeat letters or words. That's called dittography. And they might add things that were written in the margins. They might accidentally add those into the text itself. Or they might unintentionally omit words or phrases as they look back and forth. It's called haplography, especially at the ends of lines. That's called homoteluton. So you look and you see a similar word, and then you look and you write, and then you look again, and it might be a similar word that's like a couple of lines down, and then you might miss the lines in between. Once a mistake gets made in one copy, every manuscript that's made from that copy will perpetuate the error. You're copying the entire manuscript with all the mistakes there as well. So it's kind of like DNA. Textual critics can arrange manuscripts into family trees, trying to figure out which was the original and how they fit together and such. In general, no 2 manuscripts are exactly alike. And then once scribes start trying to correct mistakes, or what they assume are mistakes in the example that they're copied from, then things get really messy or really complicated. The Jewish Masoretes came up with various techniques of quality control designed to detect such errors. They determined the exact number of verses and words and letters in the Bible, and then they counted and recounted for every new manuscript to make sure that they had missed nothing. They also noted the middle word of each book so they could count on both sides, and they noted the exact middle word of the Bible as a whole. They put notations in the margins indicating unique or rare forms of particular words, some of which appear only once or twice in the entire Bible, and they'll note that. The Masoretes even included notes saying that mysterious dots over some letters or obvious misspellings should be preserved as is, right? They're trying to copy things exactly, even down to the mistakes they see in the manuscript. By the way, Hindu Brahmin priests also developed elaborate memorization techniques for ensuring that the oral Vedas were passed on exactly. Memorization matters, and in this case, exact copying matters to Jewish scribes. Okay, so the first challenge is mistakes get made as copies are done. The second major challenge was trying to establish the exact pronunciation of the text, which was more difficult than you might guess, since Hebrew is a language that's written with consonants only. If English were written without vowels, imagine how you might read the word BT, and it might be bat, or bet, or bit, or bite, and so forth. There were centuries of tradition in reading the Hebrew Bible, of course, but the Masoretes tried to nail down the exact pronunciation by adding small dots and lines under and over the consonant letters to indicate what vowels should be in those words. They also added some hooks over some letters that told readers where to put accents and pauses when the text was chanted. These are known as cantillation marks. At the time the Aleppo Codex was written, this elaborate system of vocalization and cantillation was fairly new, and the Codex is a magnificent example. In fact, Aaron ben Asher himself added the vocal pointing, the accents, and the Masoretic notes to the consonantal text that would have been written out by a scribe in his employ earlier. You should actually check out the Aleppo Codex yourself. There's a website with photographs at www.aleppocodex.org. After about a century after it was created, the Aleppo Codex was bought by a Karaite Jewish community in Jerusalem. We'll see the Karaites again in a later lecture. They were Jews who rejected the oral Torah of the rabbis, or the Talmud, and instead they wanted to focus exclusively on what was written in the Hebrew Bible. So they naturally were very interested in getting the most accurate biblical text possible. Today, nearly all Jews follow the rabbinical tradition. They look to the Talmud for guidance. There are only about 40,000 Karaites left, though they were once a major division of Judaism. Around 1050 of the Common Era, the Codex went to Jerusalem, where it remained for some 50 years, serving as an authoritative Bible for both Karaites and rabbinical Jews. In 1099, however, it was carried off as plunder by Christians in the First Crusade. The book was held for ransom, along with some other copies of the Jewish scriptures and a few actual people. The Karaite community in Ashkelon on the Mediterranean coast borrowed some money from Jews in Egypt to pay a hefty price to rescue the Aleppo Codex. Eventually, it ended up in Cairo in the care of rabbinical Jews, where it became known for its meticulous accuracy, and many scholars, including the great Maimonides, consulted it regularly. Indeed, Maimonides pronounced it a model text that ought to be followed by everyone making copies of the Bible. In the last half of the 14th century, Maimonides' great-great-great-grandson took that codex from Cairo to Aleppo, Syria, where it remained for about 600 years, locked away in the basement of the central synagogue. In an effort to keep the treasured manuscript safe, the authorities in the synagogue restricted access to it, so that, for instance, they turned down requests to photograph it in the 1920s for a scholarly edition of the Hebrew Bible. The editors of that edition had to use a somewhat later Masoretic text called the Leningrad Codex as a base text instead of the Aleppo Codex. In 1943, concerned Jews in Jerusalem sent a Hebrew university lecturer to Aleppo to gain permission to take the codex to a safer location. Right, in the 40s, there was a lot of turmoil at the time. And even, they said, if need be, to steal it to protect it. The lecturer did neither, and upon his return, someone lamented, "It's too bad we sent an honest man." In retrospect, it is indeed unfortunate that the synagogue didn't allow the text to go, or permit more scholars to take notes or photographs, because in November of 1947, that was in fact the day after the UN voted to establish the State of Israel, there was rioting in Aleppo, and a mob broke into and burned the synagogue. After more than 1,000 years, it looked like the crown of Aleppo had been lost forever. But someone, undoubtedly at great risk, managed to grab what they could of the codex, and then it was passed secretly from hand to hand until it was smuggled out of Syria and taken to Israel in 1958, apparently with quite a bit of conniving and double-crossing. Today, most of the Aleppo Codex is in the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum, where it can be seen alongside some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's missing a few pages here and there, but most disappointingly, nearly the entire Torah, remember that's the first 5 books of the Bible, which Jews regard as the most sacred part of the Bible, almost the entire Torah has been torn out and is missing. That's about 40% of the Codex, some 200 pages. That might be the end of the story, but there's a tantalizing possibility that those missing pages might someday turn up. One page came to light in 1982, and another fragment was identified in 1988. You can read a fine account of all of this in Maddie Friedman's book, The Aleppo Codex. Okay, clearly a lot of people cared a great deal about this particular manuscript because it is a nearly perfect copy of the Hebrew Bible. But what exactly is that sacred text, and where did it come from? First of all, it's not the Old Testament. As we'll see in a later lecture, early Christians regarded the Jewish scriptures as sacred, and they adopted a Greek translation called the Septuagint as part of their own canon. But the number and the order of the books were different from the Septuagint and the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, and Christians reinterpreted the text in ways that aligned with their own beliefs. Second, even though I've been calling it the Hebrew Bible, that name doesn't exactly fit either, since some of it is written in the later language of Aramaic rather than Hebrew. Not a lot of it, but a few chapters in the books of Daniel and Ezra that seem to be some of the latest books that were included within the Hebrew Bible. Probably the best name, however, is the one used by Jews themselves. They call it Tanakh, which is an acronym consisting of the first letters of the 3 major divisions: Torah, which is the 5 books ascribed to Moses, Nevi'im, the prophets, and Ketuvim, the writings. So together it's T-N-K with English letters, but Tanakh. Together, these constitute not a single book, but a library of Hebrew text in many different genres written over a 1,000-year period. For a long, long time, these writings circulated separately, with some books being regarded as authoritative in some communities, but others, but they weren't thought of as authoritative in other communities. So they circulate separately as individual scrolls. Keep in mind, too, that literacy was quite limited in the ancient world. Religious texts tended to be the concern of a few educated specialists. Eventually, however, a core group of documents was recognized by all Jews as sacred, though this worked out differently for each of the 3 biblical divisions of Tanakh. The oldest compositions of the ancient Hebrews, like those of India, were originally passed down orally by word of mouth, starting perhaps as early as the 10th century BCE, maybe at the court of King David. Various oral traditions were combined, they were edited, and then written down. Over the next few centuries, during the time of the divided kingdoms of Israel up in the north and Judah in the south, and then the destruction of Israel by the Assyrians in 722, those texts were further revised and augmented until the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE, when it appears that the Torah as we know it today had basically taken shape. So it's Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Okay, I should note that scholars argue vigorously about nearly everything that I'm going to be telling you, but I'll keep to a general consensus. So when Judah was conquered in 587, and BCE, and its leading citizens were taken captive to Babylon, it seemed as if the Jews would lose their identity as a distinct people, much like the Israelites under the Assyrians a century later, or like innumerable other ancient peoples and ethnic groups. But the Babylonians themselves were conquered by the Persians in 539 BCE, not long after the conquest of Jerusalem, and miraculously, the new king of Persia, Cyrus the Great, agreed to let the Jews in Babylon return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, after an exile that lasted for only about half a century. The return to Jerusalem did not go particularly smoothly. There was conflict with Jews who had remained in Judea, and it took 2 waves of immigration and more than 20 years to rebuild the temple, which was dedicated in 515 BCE. This is the beginning of what we call the Second Temple period. So the second temple, first temple is Solomon's temple, destroyed by the Babylonians, and then the second temple is dedicated in 515, and that will remain in Jerusalem, being continuously used pretty much until the Romans destroy it in 70 CE, of the Common Era. Nearly 60 years after the dedication of the temple in 458 BCE, another group of Jews from Babylon returned to Judea under the leadership of Ezra the scribe, and they were joined in 445 by more Jewish immigrants led by Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah were appalled at the corruption and the laxness that they found among their co-religionists in Judea, and in an attempt to reform and to unify the community, to bring it together, Ezra gathered the people, both men and women. He ascended a high wooden platform, and he read them, as it says in the Hebrew Bible, he read them the book of the law of Moses from early morning till noon. Modern scholars believe this book of the law was the Torah. The people wept. We're not sure whether it was from grief or from joy. And the next day, as it says in Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 13, the heads of the ancestral houses of all the people, with the priests and the Levites, came together to the scribe Ezra in order to study the words of the law. Thereafter, Jews in Judea began to try to live their lives in accordance with the Torah. And thus Ezra began to transform the Jews into the people of the book. That phrase actually comes from the Quran, but it's particularly apt for Judaism. To this day, Jews read the Torah aloud together every week in synagogue. If the Torah was canonized around 400 BCE, that is, if it was put in a fixed form, generally accepted as authoritative, the process took a bit longer for the second section of the Tanakh, the prophets. In Jewish Bibles, there are 2 subdivisions: the former prophets, so those are the books of Joshua through Kings, which contain many stories about figures such as Samuel and Elijah, some early prophets who seem not to have written things themselves. And then the second division is the later prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets that include Hosea through Malachi. It appears that an early version of the history of the Hebrews, or of the Israelites, in the Promised Land from Joshua's conquest to the fall of the kingdom of Judah was written shortly before the exile and then revised by Jews in Babylon. So that's the so-called Deuteronomistic history, because it uses concepts and themes from Deuteronomy, but basically goes from Joshua to the end of 2 Kings. There were also extensive revisions and additions made to the books of the so-called writing prophets during the exile, though these books probably circulated separately. Eventually, however, a standard collection came to be accepted as canonical around 200 BCE. In the New Testament, when Jesus talks about the law and the prophets, he's referring to the first 2 of those 3 divisions of Tanakh that were generally acknowledged in his day. And it's always good to remember that Jesus himself was a first-century Jew. But the matter wasn't quite settled, even in the first century. The third section of the Tanakh, the writings, was still open-ended, still kind of fluid. Today, the writings include Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Daniel, Ezra and Nehemiah. In Jewish Bibles, that's 1 book, Chronicles, and the 5 scrolls that were associated with Jewish festivals. The 5 scrolls are the Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. It's quite an eclectic collection, but as we'll see in Lecture 9, this specific list of works wasn't really agreed upon until the 2nd or maybe even the 3rd century of the Common Era. And even then, it wasn't decided by a specific leader or a council. Rather, it appears that over time, and with lots of arguments, the rabbis gradually came into agreement. Earlier Jewish communities, however, had larger collections of sacred texts. By the late Second Temple period, that is, before the Jerusalem Temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, many Jews were living far from Judea, all over the Roman Empire. It's actually rather remarkable that Jews seem to have made up about 10% of the population of the Roman Empire. Today, despite their profound influence in modern culture, there are only about 14 million Jews in the world, or maybe 1/5 of 1% of the world's population. Back in the Roman Empire, not all of these far-flung Jews were fluent in Hebrew or even in Aramaic, which was the everyday language spoken by Jews in Palestine. Aramaic is fairly closely related to Hebrew. So these Jews, scattered elsewhere in the Roman Empire, needed translations of their sacred texts. One of the most prominent of these translations was a Greek rendition called the Septuagint, and the name means the 70. That name comes from a legend that around 250 BCE, the Greek king in Egypt asked for a translation of the Torah for the library at Alexandria. He was apparently collecting books from all over the world, a terrific lover of books. And so he commissioned a translation. So they appointed 70 or 72 scholars, sources sort of vary on that, who were working for about 70 days, but they were working independently. And at the end of that time period, they all came up with exactly the same translation, which would have been miraculous indeed. I've done translations. There's no single right outcome for the process. Everyone will put things in slightly different words to try to catch the meaning. And the story that the Septuagint was agreed upon by everyone made it seem like it was really a gift from God. A Greek rendition of the remainder of the Hebrew Bible eventually rounded out the Septuagint. But where the Greek Torah and the prophets had the same books as in the Tanakh, the rest of the Septuagint included extra writings, such as the books of Judith, Tobit, Baruch, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the Wisdom of Solomon, and Sirach, which is sometimes called Ecclesiasticus. Actually, this is another problem with the story about the Septuagint, is the whole thing wasn't complete in 350 BCE. They were still waiting to add more books into that translation. Okay, so those names that I've just given you, Tobit and Baruch and Maccabees, those names may be familiar to Catholic listeners. The first Christians adopted the Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures as their own, and that tradition has continued into Catholic Bibles today. Early Protestants, by contrast, relegated biblical books that were in Greek but not in Hebrew, okay, not in the Hebrew Masoretic text. Those books went into a separate section called the Apocrypha. Martin Luther put them in between the Old and the New Testaments. And after a while, Protestants quit publishing those smaller in-between books as part of their Bibles. Why weren't the extra books in the Septuagint accepted by later Jews as scripture? When the rabbis were arguing over which text belonged in the writing section of the Tanakh, they had two basic criteria. The books had to be in Hebrew. For several of the books in the Greek Septuagint, the Hebrew originals had been lost, or they may have been written in Greek to begin with. And then the second criteria is the rabbis wanted books that they thought were at least as old as Ezra, whom they believe had brought the time of the prophets to a close. So 1st Maccabees, which is the story of the successful Jewish revolt in the 2nd century BCE. This is the book that gives us Hanukkah. Well, actually, the revolt gives us Hanukkah. The book of Maccabees doesn't talk about that celebration at all, but that whole book is out. On the other hand, some books that really were written after Ezra, like Daniel and Esther, claim to be older, and thus they were accepted through this complicated, long drawn-out process of canonization that explains why Daniel is in the writing section of the Tanakh rather than the prophets, where we might expect him. But that's still not the whole story. Several Jewish groups in the late Second Temple period thought that there were even more books that should be accepted as scriptures, that they regarded as binding and authoritative. I'm sure that you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These ancient documents, discovered in caves in 1947, were produced by a dissident group of Jews living in a desert community of Qumran from about 250 BCE to 68 CE. The clay jars, hidden away for centuries, yielded more than 220 biblical manuscripts in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, most of them just fragments, but among them was a nearly complete copy of Isaiah. Pieces of every book in the Tanakh have been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, except for Esther. And we're not exactly sure whether the people in that community didn't accept it as scripture or maybe it just got lost. We're not sure. Yet there were other non-biblical texts among the fragments, such as 1st Enoch and Jubilees, which is a reworking and an expansion of the book of Genesis, as well as books that were specific to the Qumran community, like the Community Rule, the Temple Scroll, the War Scroll, and the Thanksgiving hymns. I'll talk more about these texts in Lecture 10. Other Jews at that time wrote and treasured additional texts known as the pseudepigrapha, which means that they were ascribed to famous figures from earlier ages. These included the testaments of the 12 patriarchs and the Psalms of Solomon. None of these texts made the cut for acceptance into the Tanakh. In many ways, the Jews became the people of the book through a series of losses. The ancient Israelites were connected to their God through the land that he had promised them, through the prophets who had spoken in his name, the temple where he received sacrifices, and the kingly line God had established. That's the Davidic dynasty. During the exile, the inhabitants of Judea, who were known as Jews, were carried away to Babylon, and they lost all 4 of those. Amazingly, after a generation or 2, they were allowed to return. They again enjoyed the land and the temple, but the Davidic kings and the prophets were gone. So they compensated by gathering up and consolidated their national histories, all the stories about the prophets and the kings that had been descended from the line of David. And they started with the 5 books of the Torah that were ascribed to the greatest of all the prophets, Moses. After the Great Revolt in 66 to 70 CE, the holy city of Jerusalem was leveled by the Romans, the Second Temple was destroyed, and the dispersion of the Jews accelerated. What would become of them? I like Matty Friedman's summary. He says, there was no precedent for a scattered people remaining a people. Dispersion meant disappearance. If the Jews were to be an exception, instead of being bound by a king, a temple, or geography, they needed to be bound by something else, something portable. What emerged was the idea that people could be held together by words. That is to say, the rabbis took their lead from Ezra the scribe so many centuries earlier and created a community that would be centered on a specific text. That innovative idea would eventually affect most of the world's population through the influence of Christianity and Islam, not to mention other religions like Sikhism. Once the focus of Jewish identity became the Tanakh, it became more important than ever to carefully define its contents. And through the work of the Masoretic scholars like Aaron ben Asher, the creator of the Aleppo Codex, the exact form of that text would stay the same forever after. In the next lecture, we'll look at the contents of the Torah in more detail, followed by a lecture on the prophets and the writings. There's certainly more to the story of Jewish sacred texts after the closing of the canon, and in coming lectures we'll talk about the Talmud, a little bit about Jewish mysticism, and the rise of textual scholarship that attempted to correct the standard Masoretic text on the basis of other versions such as the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it's fascinating to trace the development of a faith where religious authority belongs to scholars rather than to prophets or priests. And the extreme reliance on a sacred text makes the inscription on the Aleppo Codex rather poignant. It says there, it's sort of written over on the margins or before it. The Aleppo Codex has an inscription that says, "Blessed is he who preserves it, and cursed be he who steals it. It may not be sold, and it may not be defiled forever." The book is everything.